building these language models is really expensive, and there's only a few companies that can do that. That means even though we have so many applications and uses of these tools out there, they more or less all go back to a very relatively small set of language models. And knowing that these language suggestions sort of shape our language, will we lose variety in language and if everything converges on the same language models?
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week, on Speaking of Language,
Malte Jung shares some insights into how artificial intelligence affects the way human beings interact not only with technology, but with one another.
Welcome to a new episode of Speaking of Language. I'm Angelika Kramer, the director of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University.
And I'm Sam Lupowitz, the LRC's media manager.
We are excited to speak with Dr. Malte Jung today and hear more about his research on artificial intelligence and the impacts on communication and language.
Welcome to Speaking of Language, Malte.
Thank you so much.
So before we dive into your fascinating research on AI and all the work you do around that, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and maybe also a little bit about your own path with languages?
Mm-hmm. Wow, yeah. Okay, about languages. Okay, I'll come back to that later. I have to think about that a bit. So I'm faculty right now in the information science department here at Cornell. Mm-hmm. My background, though, is in mechanical engineering. So if I think about my research, what always interested me, my core topic of interest is actually design. I was always interested in how things are made and often driven by a frustration how badly things are made and how badly they look like. And so I started to set out about that, studying mechanical engineering in Munich, so approaching it more from the technical end. And when I speak about design, I'm not thinking about like in terms of industrial design or graphic design. I'm thinking about just broadly how we as people come to make things and think about making things better. And then when I moved to Stanford for my PhD, I got more interested in the people who are doing the designing, the engineering designers, and try to understand what makes a good engineering team. And my dissertation ended up being about, I guess you might say in terms of language, I ended up looking at emotion expression and found that the same pattern of emotional interaction that predict whether couples will end up in a divorce also tell us how good an engineering team will perform.
Oh, how interesting.
So it was very unintuitive in mechanical engineering to say, hey, actually the most important thing you should think about is emotion expression, not the technical stuff that mattered less than how people interacted emotionally. And sort of that started that sort of interest in really understanding, I guess you might say language and interpersonal dynamics. And from then on, I went into this question about how our interactions shaped by technology. And that's what I pretty much spent the past 10 years on.
Okay.
A lot of that focusing on robots, trying to understand how they change, how we relate and interact with others. And then part of it now, of course, the AI stuff that we've been looking into.
Fascinating.
Yeah. And also, I feel like anyone who has ever tried to put furniture together with their partner, that makes a lot of sense. That's immediately what I started to think
of. Yes, absolutely.
So, fantastic. Well, moving on, you co-authored an article that was published in the journal Scientific Reports last year titled Artificial Intelligence in Communication Impacts Language and Social Relationships. What did your research find?
What did we find? I mean, the key thing what we found is that AI changes how we perceive others, and it changes our interaction, the language we use when we engage others, and how much we like each other after we use it in interaction. That was the key. That was sort of the key finding, because we often think about how these tools sort of help us, how they make us more effective or more efficient. But I think what's often missing from that focus is really when we use it. How does it change how we interact with others and relate to them? And that's what we set out to find out, to really understand. Okay, what do these things do to our interactions with other people?
And in this particular research project, you looked at text-based communication, like typed communication, right? Can you extrapolate, like, what are there implications that you can draw from your specific research about spoken communication? Do you think there might be a difference from typed communication?
I mean, like most of our studies that we've done before explored really how physical robots change how we interact with others. And I mean, the effects there are, we can see that happen. For example, in one study we had we asked two people to build a physical tower with a robot out of Jenga blocks. And the robot's task was to pick up the blocks from a box and hand them over to people. Like it was sort of mimicking situations that we imagined when people might work in manufacturing with a robot, and the robot helps them accomplish their task. And sort of people built that tower. But the thing was that the robot then had to make a decision whom it gives the block to. And what we wanted then to see is about, does it make a difference if the robot prefers one person or the other, gives one more? And we found that if the robot gives one person more of these blocks, people like each other less. But they were also... It created these changes in language and interaction. There was sort of this one moment where the robot picked up a block, and this one participant kind of seemed to anticipate that she would be getting that block and reached out with her hands to receive it. But then the robot gave it to the other person, which created this really awkward sort of moment where you could see it changed the whole expression. It's this tense smile, and then this awkward pulling the hand back. And then that created this also awkward moment for the other person, who then had to sort of figure out, like, oh, what the heck do I do with this now? And figure out to check in then with the other person. Are we still friends here? Are we still okay? And so it's more like this way in which these machines often subtly change the whole dynamic of an interaction and sort of opportunities they create.
Yeah. Well, and I think that'll be really interesting, because I do think, I mean, I don't know if we will be surrounded by physical robots in the near future. I don't know what your take is going to be on that. But certainly AI bots, I mean, I'm just thinking about, all the ChatGPTs out there. And that impact on social dynamics and as people interact with those bots. It's an interesting area of research and constantly changing, I bet.
It's a crazy space. I mean, there's a ton that's happening. I mean, these things move so fast. I mean, just another example that came to mind about how maybe these more language system or bots might change how we interact. There was an article on Medium, this online magazine, years ago that was titled something like Alexa is marvelous, but it turned my kid into an asshole. I might have to bleep that out. But sort of this article told the story about this father who brought this technology in the home, and then as adults we know that these systems work best if we use very simple language. So we say, Alexa, play this, Alexa, buy that. But then his son picked up on that language and then used it with others and say, Mama, get me milk, Papa, do this. And so, which of course is we don't respond well to that language. And so the interesting thing, I think, often is that people, when they build these systems, they don't think about that the way we design these technologies can sometimes implicitly set norms of conduct or of interaction that then have social implications that go beyond the interaction with the system. So if it might if you interact like that with the Alexa, but then it's not just that. The interactions around it are shaped in really complex ways too. And that's the kind of stuff that I get really interested in. And with these now LLMs, I mean, this is when it gets really complex. And for me, often these things that are interesting is the less sort of the you're talking with a robot or a chatbot in language, is more these subtle ways in which these systems might sort of nudge our interactions in a way we're not really aware of. That's why these smart replies got so interesting when they got introduced like almost 8 years ago or so with Google Allo. That's not even existing anymore, that messenger. That was the first one. But it sort of really was sort of a glimpse ahead of what these large language models do now, because we just integrate them into our language, and then it sort of does stuff that we're not fully aware of.
Well, and those smart replies were a big part of the research in that article. Can you actually briefly explain for our listeners what smart replies are?
Yeah, so smart replies, I think, really came up at the time. That was, I think, in 2016 when Google released Google Allo, and that was a messenger, like any messenger that had this smart reply capability. And smart reply are pretty much algorithmically generated response suggestions. So in Google Allo, it looked like you typed a message or you received a message, and then you had sort of three little suggestions what you might answer. So someone says hello to you, then the options might be an hi, how are you, and a smiley or something. And then you could, rather than typing, you could just click on it. I mean, the more current versions of that is in the email, is that you have a sentence that's there and you can just accept it, or a sentence completion. And it's pretty much the same as if you're asking ChatGPT to draft you an email. But these were sort of these short replies. And the thing at the time that really got us interested in smart replies was that the focus, the way all the research was focused on, was on this idea that how do we design these smart replies so that we can make your writing more efficient and effective? So because they were designed, because it's tricky to type on a small keyboard.
Sure.
Sort of, it was all with that in mind, and we were looking at these and thinking about, okay, what does it actually do to our interactions when I'm using language that I might not naturally write, even if it's good enough. And that's what sort of started that research in 2016. Took a long time to get it published. But the funny thing is now it's even more relevant than then. These kinds of systems are so ubiquitous.
Yeah. Well, you were ahead of the times. I like it.
So in a Cornell Chronicle article about your work, you were quoted, "Technology companies tend to emphasize the utility of AI tools to accomplish tasks faster and better, but they ignore the social dimension. We do not live and work in isolation, and the systems we use impact our interactions with others." So, what impact do you see for education, and how can AI support communication and learning?
Yeah, I think the for education, I think in general, I think there's always, what we found is this impact on both language and perception and interaction. I think the key thing is what I said, is like you use these things and it might nudge you to use language in a way that you wouldn't use otherwise. For example, what we found is that these Google-generated smart replies, the one that the standard Google algorithm produces, are slightly more positive in tone than what people normally would write. And so if you're using that stuff, you use friendlier, let's say, friendlier language than you wouldn't. And so it that kind of shifts then how others see you. We found that there are two things going on. It's like when people suspect you to use that stuff, they see you in a negative light. So it can backfire. So it can go both ways. But it means, on the one hand, it means that whoever, when you have control over the language, you can nudge people. You have control over the interaction and over the perceptions. Because we found when we created artificial smart replies with a more negative tone, the language turned more negative, and then the perceptions turned more negative as well. And sort of for educational learning. I mean, learning is always so dependent on interaction. I mean, how our conversations go. If our tone of interactions turns hostile and contemptuous, we won't learn from each other anymore. It's like whatever goes in my ear, one ear comes out the other. And so I think kind of learning is really dependent on the quality of our interaction and language. So I think that is for me would be one part to look at.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it'll be really interesting to see too with all these LLMs what difference or how do differences in cultural background, how does that play? Factor into that, right? We approach this from a language learning and using different languages perspective, and that's something that I'm wondering about. Does ChatGPT have a different personality in French than it does in German than it does in English? I don't know. I think that would be really interesting to see too. Like, what are the social dynamics there, and is it more friendly or less friendly in one language than in another?
Yeah, those are fascinating questions. I think there's that people are starting to explore that all these questions on culture. And one of my colleagues, René Kieselcheck, has done some work on that. Really, really cool stuff. I mean, one of the things we wondered often is the larger impact of language on these systems when because right now at least that might change, but right now building these language models is really expensive, and there's only a few companies that can do that. That means even though we have so many applications and uses of these tools out there, they more or less all go back to a very relatively small set of language models.
Yeah.
And so for the question, kind of, we often asked ourselves after that research, knowing that these language suggestions sort of shape our language, will we lose sort of the variety in language, and if everything converges sort of on the same language models that are trained on Western, maybe predominantly white male data set. Do we lose cultural variety in how we express ourselves?
So it's the anti-Tower of Babel.
The anti-Tower of Babel.
Huh. Interesting. Yeah, it'll be quite fascinating to see where this all is taking us. Wild.
You also lead the Robots in Groups lab, which focuses on design and behavioral aspects of human-robot interaction in group and team settings. Apart from the landing page of that lab's website being amazing, tell us more about the work you do there.
Oh, that's nice that you say that. We just had a meeting in my lab saying we haven't maintained that website in more than 5 years. It's so outdated. I mean, I still like
not to us.
the picture we created with my then researcher with Hamish Tennant created that graphic that you're just looking at, and then the logo we put together. That was fun. I still like that. We're actually just in the process of changing our lab name to interplay as the theme, because we have done a lot of robots and teamwork. We moved away from that. But going back to your question, sort of the topic, the lab was sort of started with this idea to understand how robots change how we work and interact and collaborate in teams. And it was really started with this motivation that when I came from a study of teams into this research community that studies robots and the human-computer interaction community to a larger degree, there was sort of what surprised me was that almost all of the work focuses on interactions between a single human and a single robot. So in that research community, we have learned so much about how the psychology of human-robot interaction, how the makeup of a robot, how it looks like, how it behaves, shapes our cognition, our responses, how we think about it. And we've also learned how to better and better, even though they still don't work well, design these machines better to be pleasant and easy to interact with. But but for me, it was looking at having studied teams. I know that we don't live alone. We don't work alone. There's always people around us, and we rely on these interactions. And so, the question came up is like, why is no one studying how these machines shape these kind of interactions? Shift the focus from the interaction with the machine to the interaction with the people. So that was the general idea where that lab name came from, and the direction for the lab. And so then we studied this in all sorts of different ways. I mean, we did field work where we actually went out for several years and studied actual surgeons performing surgery with a robot, and we compared that to traditional laparoscopic surgery, and learned about the really complex way in how this surgical robot transforms all the interactions in the operating room. It changes the entire sensorium of surgery, and then learning how the sort of entire team sort of compensates for all that changes and builds new routines and ways of working. Another part of the lab has been more kind of behavioral sciencey, psychology type studies where we bring participants in the lab, sit them around a table, and then there's a robot that does something. Like in an early study, we had robots that intervenes in conflicts and calls people out when they say something bad. And then we tried to see, okay, what happens then? Those are kinds of studies we did. And then we had a part of the lab where we tried to imagine how robots might be useful in helping us build better interaction dynamics. And this is an area where we are thinking about robots as potential social catalysts that in some way can not just to actually be better with each other. That's another more a design-focused space that we have explored in the lab.
This is fascinating.
Yeah.
This is wild. You know, sometimes we get so hung up in our own little worlds and the work that we do and the little research that we do that it's just so fascinating to me to hear these types of projects and the impact they have. Malte, we would be remiss not to ask you, as an expert on robots and human interaction, should our listeners be preparing themselves for the robot uprising?
Oh, well, I think that's a question always people in robotics get
and we have asked this question of many
AI adjacent knowledgeable guests.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we're tickled to hear what you have to say to this.
I have to say I never think about that question much because I think...
Okay, well, because robots are so ubiquitous in your life?
I mean, they're all around. We always... I mean, the way I'm thinking about...
they have risen already.
They have risen. In a way, they have risen already. The way I'm thinking about a robot is less like these... Often when we think about robots, we have this idea of this humanoid robot with eyes and a body, or the Terminator in the negative case, or whatnot. But like for me, when I'm thinking about robot, I'm thinking more about a washing machine or a smart speaker. I mean, an autonomous car. Kind of more this thing about like how our everyday devices, through their capabilities, are more becoming robots. They can respond to us, and they're there and are already, and they're so badly designed. And I think that's more what we should be worried about. Like I was an example is this is not the robot uprising, but this is these ways in which these machines are out there. I was on sabbatical last year, and we spent the year in Vancouver, a lot of it. And Vancouver is full of Teslas. And this one evening I was pushing walking my bike through the city, and I was walking past this Tesla, and then suddenly the car was flashing the lights at me. And I got so offended by this. I was really pissed, and I was thinking, what expletive here is flashing their lights at me when I'm walking here with my bike? And I look at the car, and there's, of course, no one in there. And And then I thought, okay, it must have triggered some sort of safety.
Yeah, proximity, whatever, yeah.
Proximity alarm, safety thing. And then, okay, I tried it out with the next Tesla. And I found, if I walk in the right angle and the right speed, the thing flashes its light. And then
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And then I peeked in the car, and then I noticed the screen goes on and shows this image of this glowing orb, and with this text underneath that says "Sentry system activated." So it's this really hostile stance.
Yeah,
that,
better be
that
careful, or
it's
it'll...
taken. And I did some research later, and I found out that actually when that triggered, the system actually video records you and sends a video to the owner, which already feels like very invasive.
No kidding. Yeah.
But also I found that the original image they used was that for that screen of hell from Kubrick's Space Odyssey. They used an image of an AI that killed an entire space crew as the appropriate thing to represent that car. And I was thinking, what again? Kind of, it might make sense for if I'm the owner of the car, I want my car protected.
Yeah.
But what does that do to the social environment it creates outside? Like such a hostile stance. And actually, later I looked online, and tons of people had posted videos of that. And there was one video on YouTube from one person, an owner of a Tesla, with a plea to Elon Musk to let them switch off that feature because he had recorded how someone at night, kind of his car had done that to a person. Could show the video of a person walking by, the lights flash up, and then that person ends up vandalizing the Tesla in reaction. Because
totally, yeah.
And so you create
not surprising
hostile behavior based on this stuff. And
absolutely.
So, long answer, but I don't think, this is, I think, what we should worry about is more like, okay, what's the reality we are already creating with these machines that behave in ways that are really often not conducive to a good social climate.
Yeah. No, I love that answer because it reflects. I love it because it reflects how I feel about the idea, even though we sort of joke about it, of robot uprising, because it's that it's not the technology itself that I fear. It's the reaction that it spurs from people, and I think that's very, very sharp, very prescient. Yeah. So what other projects are you currently working on, and where can our listeners find out more about your work?
What other projects are we working on? Right now, I mean, our lab is broad. There's still a lot of work on robots. One of my students, she's trying to understand a really cool work on this little bit of question about why social robots are. Let's say different. She works on a research project that started with this question: why do these social robots, these cute, small, little ones, are successful in Japan, but they've all failed here? I mean, there was several startups in the U.S. that created these small, cute robots that interact you and hopefully that kind of, I don't know, talk your kids to sleep and whatnot. And they were not successful. And in Japan, there are several examples of those robots where people spend thousands of dollars on, and they work. And so she spent several months of field work in Japan trying to understand that. And what she walked away with, sort of the story, I thought was really cool, because right now, this question of how do we make sociable robots is one of really the big questions that founded the whole field of human-robot interaction. And that work has always focused just on the robot. Like sociality was this idea is to be found in the robot, in how we design it, how it looks like, whether it looks cute, what materials we use, and how it behaves, what it does, and how it learns over time. And what we found, and Waki Kamino, who led the study through her work in Japan, was that we should actually, or was this insight that we've looked for sociality in all the wrong places. It's not about the robot. It's about the entire ecology that robot is embedded in. That the robot is social because of the communities that are built around it, around the interactions it affords. And these companies in Japan that built these machines, their design space is not just the robot. They curate all these interactions carefully. They curate online spaces. They curate events, and people form communities. And sort of the also what makes these machines sort of take on meaning or help create meaning in people's lives is not in the interaction with the machine, even though there might be some, but it's a lot more in the meaning that's created by all the new relations people form and interactions people have with other people. So that's one line of work that's moving forward that I thought was really really cool to understand these machines in their ecology and what happens there. Another bigger space, what we're trying to explore is more methodologically about how we're trying to do our work. That's moving away from from doing this more psychology work in the lab to going out more in the field and doing more work through design, where we kind of take an approach that uses design as a research method. Kind of this idea that there are things we can only learn about the world when we start pushing buttons and change things.
Sure.
And this is an area that's exciting for me methodologically. And then still interested in understanding robots in machines more in the field. One of my students, he does that. We have a project that's led by my colleague Angelique Taylor at the Tech Campus, at Cornell's Tech Campus. And she's working with people at the medical school, in the hospital, to build robots that help teams also in the emergency room. She builds a robotic crash guard. And so we're trying to understand then at the same time doing the more social science of how do these teams work, how do they work with technology, but then also how do we design a machine that helps them in their work and understanding what this machine does. That's part of the space. But right now the lab is really kind of mixed. Like we have people coming more from engineering with a technical interest, and I have an artist from South America in the lab.
Cool.
Then one of my students has a philosophy background. So it's a whole mix, and then fun to see what sort of happens there. That's also why I decided, okay, we're shifting a little bit from that more narrow focus on robots and groups and teams to more, let's focus on interplay as what we do, because we like that term, because everything always boils back to the interplay, whether it's between people with each other, people and machines. And I like that notion of play rather than interaction, because I think what we try to do in the lab is, because I think learning happens best in a mode of play, in some form of playful engagement. And that's kind of what we sort of aspire to in the lab, to approach research from a playful perspective.
That's awesome. Great. Well, this is fascinating. I could sit here and listen to your stories forever. This is really amazing work and impactful work and work that will literally save lives in the future. So thank you to you and all your colleagues for doing this amazing work.
Thank you so much for having me.
But before we sign off, we would like to ask you to share a word in a language that you speak, you love, you are learning, you may want to learn, that does not exist in English, but you wish it did.
Oh, yeah. I saw that in your email today in the morning. And I was like, I was thinking, oh, my God, what do I think of? I mean, I thought immediately of two, and you can pick which one. The one was, it made me smile. I hadn't used that in a long time here because I never hear it. A friend on Facebook had posted this picture of a piece of cotton wool, just a clump, and then it was in a glass box on a pedestal. And then all he wrote underneath was Kunst. I loved this, and sort of it's a tricky word to describe. I mean, literally, it's just a Swabian or Palatine pronunciation of the German word Kunst, like for art, but so it's not just a different dialect. It's sort of the way we used it when I was little. It was more. It takes on a different meaning, and if we, I don't know, used it in a way to describe art that tries too hard.
Got it.
It's a bit related maybe to kitsch, but not quite. It's like maybe we should take kitsch, but kitsch that pretends to be high art and serious. So it's a
pretension. Yeah.
It's a pretentious. I don't know how you would describe Kunst, but
And it was actually spelled with SCH, yeah?
yeah,
Kunst.
Kunst,
Ja, sehr schön.
and D at the end.
Oh, even better. Okay. That's awesome.
But yeah, the other word I was thinking about was that I like is etepetete.
Oh, yeah.
Which is maybe also sort of a pretentiousness-related term. It's a little bit a condescending term, maybe to describe.
Good one.
To describe people who take themselves very, very serious and also sort of exhibit a pretentiousness.
I haven't thought about etepetete in forever. Yeah.
I like that. It's just a sort of
one that sounds good.
It sounds good.
Yeah.
Etepetete just sounds good.
Awesome.
Very true. Well, this has been a joy. Thank you so much for speaking of language with us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. This is a lot of fun.
It is. We think so.
Indeed, so we do. Tune in next week to hear about art, literature, and visual culture of Cuba and the Cuban diaspora from the new program manager of Cornell's Latin American and Caribbean Studies program.
Until then.
Auf Wiederhören.
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu.
And follow Cornell LRC on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
Speaking of Language is produced by Angelika Kramer and Sam Lupowitz.
Recorded by Sam Lupowitz.
Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.
Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University.
As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University.
We thank our listeners, and do stay tuned for our next episode.